Welcome, everybody, to yet another episode of Empire State of Cannabis. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time it is when you're listening or watching this. We have Kate Hruby on today. So Kate is a lead policy analyst. She's somewhat new to the team. So I think this is an introduction to people who've been following for a while. She came on about March, right around legalization. And Kate has led our policy research team and, doing a lot of work for our clients. And something that she's been very busy on is being the lead author on our new white paper on energy efficiency. And so energy efficiency has kind of become a topic that has started to be a little polarized. And I think it's kind of an issue, right? It's this idea of, either you have indoor grow, which is not environmentally sustainable, or outdoor grow, which solves everything, right? And that's just not true, right? There's a lot of nuance there to, what makes efficiency in a growing operation and, how we can kind of reduce a lot of these negative externalities, and these effects on the environment. So Kate, really dived into the science with our Chief Agriculture Officer, all this. It's a 29-page report.
Yeah, it's pretty extensive.
Yeah, it is very extensive. Decently easy to read, though. Don't worry, there's some cool graphics. So if you haven't checked that out, you can find it on our website. It's great. And it's great even if you're a casual observer of the industry and you just want to understand more even about cultivation, right? Because there's a lot of data in here about cultivation. So Kate, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Kaylin.
I know you're a listener, or at least you're supposed to be. But yeah, so what really drove you and the team? Obviously, I contributed to this report too, but what really drove kind of the desire to get something like this out?
Yeah, so we've seen, as you mentioned, an increase in interest in energy efficiency, especially with the MRTA passing in March. And so there have been, since the MRTA passed, there have been other pieces of proposed legislation that are now sitting in committee in the state legislature dealing with cultivator energy efficiency specifically, and imposing some requirements on cultivators in terms of light fixtures and HVAC requirements, as well as water and waste management. So we thought it was important to get the industry perspective out there, just because we've seen other states who have legalized attempt to mandate specific technologies or specific procedures in cultivation that haven't necessarily manifested their energy efficiency goals. And some of that has to do with a lack of involvement of stakeholders. Specifically, Illinois has very specific requirements, and that's actually the state on which some state legislators, Patricia Fahey in particular, modeled her proposed...
Assemblywoman Fahey from Albany, and so she introduced a bill in, it was like about April, after the MRTA passed, right, that would specifically mandate certain requirements, right? And I think that was alarming for the industry, right?
Yes.
It didn't go to a committee vote, right? And I think that the Assemblymember Fahey and Senator Hinchy, I think they're very open to but I think what it is a lot of times the legislation in Albany, it begins a conversation, right? And it sets the tone of how these issues are going to be worked out, right? And I think there was a desire here, Kate, with this paper to kind of roll back some of that thinking and say, there's a way to reach the goal. We share a same goal here, but there's different ways to get there, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And I think including industry in that conversation is really important. I think, you need to understand the technical constraints and requirements that cultivators are working under. You need to understand where they're coming from. And especially when we're moving to transition one of the biggest cannabis black markets in the country to a legal market, we need to really provide not just mandates, but educational resources. We need to provide some of these folks who have been working in the shadows for so long with the education and perhaps financial incentives so that they can actually succeed. I think when we're, dealing with such a nascent industry, we need to be mindful of the fact that we're doing a lot of these things considering that cannabis is an intrastate market for the first time. So we might need to study energy usage before we make decisions, before we impose very specific lighting fixture mandates on cultivators, mandates that have not necessarily worked in other states. When you impose a mandate, people are always going to try to get around it somehow.
That's true. But you can see the desire, though, because you hear these reports of, Denver, I think it's like 1 or 2% of the energy usage comes from indoor cultivation. There's been stories of like that coming out of Massachusetts, right? So, these lights and HVAC and cannabis cultivation is an energy hog.
Yeah.
And it also uses a lot of water, right? And so there's this idea that, well, if you just grow outdoors, everything will be fine. The problem with that, I think, too, is you're still going to have standards there. And we're not talking about quality, but we can talk about quality and why outdoor growing is not feasible, in terms of a large share of the market in New York. But to put that aside for a second, I mean, when you look at the destruction that mostly illicit grows have had on ecosystems, specifically in California, in federal and state lands, it's pretty staggering, right? I mean, the toll that it takes, and I mean, obviously these are illicit operators, so maybe they don't necessarily care too much on the impacts of the environment, but these fertilizers, the pesticides used and whatnot, is just it's not good for these ecosystems.
It's not. I mean, and California, if we're going to talk about the differences between states, I think we also need to talk about the states themselves, the resources of the state itself. I mean, California is unique in that it's already got a water problem. It's had water problems for 70 years, or more. And so different states might have different needs when it comes to energy efficiency and energy resource, and not just energy efficiency, but resource usage.
Yeah, well, that's a great point. I mean, we have no shortage of water here in New York. I mean, it's going to rain again today. For the third time this week. I think we're like 10 inches of rain in Binghamton in July. So, I mean, there's no shortage of good, fresh water and clean water, but also what happens to runoff, right? Because, agricultural runoff is a problem. And New York has so much water, and we also have these very delicate ecosystems, water ecosystems, right? Water ecosystems are some of the most delicate ecosystems just by very nature. And so, how we protect those, right? And I think, I don't know if that's something that was really, covered too much in the white paper. I know we talked more about cultivation, indoor cultivation, but I think that's a key, that there is still negative effects associated with growing outdoors.
Of course, and when you're in an indoor environment, you can control those things more. You can control runoff, water use more so than you can, say, if you're growing outdoors and you're using nutrients or pesticides in your soil. That is potentially affecting groundwater
or soil, or even if you're fertigating, right? So if you're pushing nutrients through some sort of drip line irrigation or something like that, absolutely. And then also, so I mean, I guess the counter argument to that is, well, you could just mandate, organic growing outdoors, but that gets to this issue of quality, right?
Exactly.
So what did you find when you're exploring with all this, really the viability of growing outdoors in New York?
Well, I mean, it's not viable for high quality flower. And there are a couple of reasons for that. New York has a really short growing season, especially in the upstate. We don't have a climate like California. We don't even have a climate like Colorado. I mean, in some areas of Colorado, you might have a long growing season outdoors. but New York doesn't. So that's one thing. You're probably not going to be able to produce enough high quality flower to serve the market.
Okay.
If you're just doing outdoors.
And so when you say short growing season, really talking about the elements and,
Yes.
cold weather, hard frost, freezes, rain, in the month of October.
Exactly. I mean, and with climate change, I mean, who knows what types of storms we're going to see. I mean, we've already seen a really volatile summer.
Yeah, well, the intensity, right? And I think, if you look last year, very dry.
Yeah.
This year turning out to be a very wet summer.
Yeah.
The year before, 2019, was very wet. 2018, very dry, right? So you have these extremes. I mean, this is playing out all over the world right now. So the volatility and also I think from an economic perspective, that's tough for growers too,
Exactly.
not knowing whether they're going to have a full crop. Now, the other part of that from a quality perspective, when it comes to biological contamination, right? How much of an issue is that for outdoor cultivation?
I mean, it's a huge issue between bugs and between molds and things like that. It's a lot more, it's a lot more susceptible to contamination because you're not in a controlled environment. You're subject to, the changes in weather, changes in,
Pests.
Yeah,
Pests, birds, animals, wildlife,
exactly.
right? Those all bring biological contamination, mycotoxins, etc. And so I don't think this is to say that there's not a place for outdoor cultivation in New York, right? I mean, that's not what the paper says. Huh?
No.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just that we have to be realistic about this market.
Yeah.
People want high quality flower. We're not going to be able to do that just with outdoor. We're not going to be able to say federal legalization occurs years down the road. New York, if we set up a market that's, where we're favoring outdoor grows because of energy uses, New York will not be able to compete once, cannabis is federally legalized. There's no way. So we're kind of setting up a commercial market that's going to fail.
Yep. Yeah. Well, and I think that's the biggest fear of regulators is the marketplace is going to fail generally, right? And that we won't have enough supply for the stores that they want to open. So let's get into why exactly indoor cultivation uses so much energy, and how your research found you could kind of limit some of that energy usage.
Yeah, so indoor cultivation is pretty complex. It uses, you're using light fixtures, high intensity light fixtures to simulate a naturally occurring photo period. So in the different stages of the cultivation process, vegetative and flowering are the two big ones, but you've also got germination and seedling and the clone phase, which occur before that. But vegetative and flowering use a lot of energy because you're using light in the vegetative phase for 18 to 24 hours a day in some grow operations, where the lights are on for 18 to 24 hours. And then for the flowering phase, you're using typically 1,000-watt high-intensity discharge bulbs or high-pressure sodium bulbs, 12 hours per day, and then 12 hours of darkness. So you're simulating essentially the end of a harvest season to stimulate flowering.
Or the start of harvest, or the beginning to what would be, harvest season, which would be in New York. 12-hour day would be sometime in mid-August, right? Where, flowering occurs maybe a little bit earlier. Because, as you say, cannabis is photosensitive. So some of the policy proposals, right, pretty much look at new technology, LED lighting technology, right? What makes LEDs more efficient than, say, HPS?
Well, they're emitting less photon. They're using less energy to produce a dense stream of photons, to essentially emit photons from the fixture itself.
Okay.
So the input wattage is typically less on an LED light.
For the same result?
No, well, that's what we kind of talk about in the paper. The difference between LEDs and your more traditional high-intensity discharge bulbs has to do with the spread of the particles, the way the particles are actually emitted from the light fixtures.
The photons.
The photons.
That's created from the sun, and you know, photons are coming down and hitting us. If you watch Cosmos and Neil deGrasse Tyson, he has the sand, and that pours down, and that's the photons. That's how you simulate.
And that's a good way to think about it, as sand emitted from the light and from the fixture. And what we see with LEDs is we see a cylindrical emission of these photons, almost like sand coming down in a cylinder. Straight down.
Okay.
With high-intensity discharge bulbs, the more traditional bulbs that we see in cannabis cultivation, what you actually have is almost like a trapezoid shape or a cone. Think about it like a cone or a trapezoid. So those particles are being emitted over a larger spread. And what that means is that when you're hanging lights over a table, which is 4 by 4 foot is typical in indoor grows, you're actually getting more of a spread from these traditional HID bulbs, high intensity discharge bulbs, than you do from LEDs. So what that means for a grower is you would have to use more LED bulbs per table, 6 generally speaking, to compare to 2 more traditional high intensity discharge bulbs. And the problem in cannabis cultivation is we don't really have the performance data collected on a large scale, meaning energy usage per cultivation site per month over time, in comparison with the specifics of that site, i.e. what fixtures are they using, to be able to really understand what fixtures are most efficient in certain grow scenarios.
Gotcha. And so that's all to say, though, the heat generated from HIDs is still much greater than LEDs. But,
yes.
But are you saying that, and we'll go back to the data because we need data. Are you saying that it kind of equals out between HID and LEDs? Like, are you still seeing a energy savings then between 6 LEDs compared to 2 HIDs? Is the wattage used the same at that point?
So, well, we don't really know. We have to really collect the data to understand that. However, you'd have to do some pretty serious calculations to understand that, and we need to educate cultivators so that they understand, when they're purchasing light fixtures, what might be more efficient. But we haven't really seen, enough data collection to be able to run even the numbers to know whether or not LEDs in practice are more efficient. When you look at them on paper, LEDs do look more efficient in terms of the input of watts and the output of photons from that fixture.
So basically you're telling me that we don't really know.
Yes.
If LEDs, so mandating LEDs doesn't really solve the problem, does it?
No, because you have to use significantly more fixtures, and you really need to understand cultivation, the technical requirements of cultivation, in order to even make policy on this issue. Because when policymakers when they're preparing a piece of proposed legislation, they might be looking at, what the producer of this light fixture says it does. An LED producer, a producer of LEDs has an incentive to say that this is more efficient.
Sure.
Right. But if you mandate this technology and it turns out that you need to use more lights, and, cultivators might even, there is a financial incentive to have the quickest flowering, to have the quickest grow cycle that you can, right?
Sure. To
get the most harvest per year in an indoor grow environment. So, it might be that you're using, if you don't really understand what you're doing, but you know that you have to use this light, if you're coming from the black market and you might not really have considered, energy efficiency before, because your main concern was, okay, I'm gonna just make sure that I don't get caught by the cops.
Sure.
you might think that, okay, well, if I string more lights, I can get more yields per year, or I can get a faster yield without really understanding the technology. And if the only mandate is, well, you have to use this type of light, that doesn't really solve the problem of how much energy use a total site is actually using.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that makes sense. So what is the recommendation then for this paper for policymakers? What are they supposed to do? I mean, they want to ensure that there is, not this huge negative effect on the environment. New York so the context is right now, New York is trying to become the most aggressive goals and targets for becoming, very low or close to net zero carbon emissions statewide, right? So, which I think poses an interesting dilemma there too, right? Because there is this kind of more philosophical question of, well, if the energy being used is renewable, replenishable energy, is it a problem? I mean, and that's a question, I guess, for lawmakers to figure out. But I mean, really, do we, if the entire state is run on renewable energy, which it isn't now, but a large percent in upstate is generated by renewable energy, and parts of the state, hydroelectric and wind and solar, does efficiency even matter at that point?
Well, I mean, that kind of goes to one of our key recommendations from this paper, and that is that the state-sponsored voluntary education and certification program, wherein a cultivator could take this course, get a certification, and then be able to put this seal on their products to show that their products were made sustainably, while also qualifying them for tax credits if they employ renewable energy on their site, and they're able to show that their energy usage is beneath a certain threshold.
So they meet these standards, they get a seal, that seal goes on the product, the bud, so consumers know. And then there are also tax credits, and the tax credit we're talking about, and it's interesting because the other white paper report that we did was on the disastrous effects of the THC tax. Well, it's here, it's in the statute, so we might as well use it, to benefit, this energy efficiency goals. And so what we're saying is to give a tax credit for that cultivation tax, because we do know the cultivation tax is going to affect small producers more so than large producers, right? Smaller scale, economies of scale, obviously, right? So this is an incentive to deploy efficiency, practices and technology and renewable energy, right? But what it also does, because the cultivation tax directly affects the price on the shelf, this might be able to say, okay, well, it costs a little more to produce more, sustainably grown cannabis, but that's offset by this tax credit. And so therefore you have price parity, right? So you have two eighths sitting on the shelf for the same amount, one with a energy efficiency seal, and the kind of thinking is that many New Yorkers are going to go, I want the energy efficiency, the efficient, sustainable product over, the other one.
Exactly. And to have comparable pricing on that, to have equal pricing on that. So an important part of that is that when, a person is going after this certification, right, they should be able to show through a site plan, their cultivation site plan might reflect that they're using solar panels on their roof, that their whole roof is covered with solar panels. That's an innovative way to offset the entire energy usage of a site, to at least be, if we're talking about net metering, if somebody could get to net zero by employing, solar panels both on their roof and maybe have an acre of solar panels on their site, that should be a factor in, the total analysis of a site's energy usage. And that's why we need to both look at a site plan and then look at the performance of that site over time to see actually how much energy this site is actually using. We don't really, if you only mandate specific technology, you're not actually looking at the site plan. You're not looking at the technology employed. You're not looking at a comprehensive approach to energy efficiency, because you're not accounting for the fact of whether or not somebody is employing renewable technology in other ways in their site that actually contributes to an overall goal of being more energy efficient and using, renewable technology.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. And so, what would you say to activists who are like, well, there's this option for outdoor, I understand, it might be difficult. We could do organic, this, and that. What would you say to that? And also, it almost seems like this paper is kind of advocating for a middle ground and saying greenhouses is the way, right? To kind of balance the needs for quality, but also look at the, effects on the environment.
Yeah.
But, obviously, we're an industry-focused group.
Yeah.
And we're representing the interests of industry, and we work with these small cultivators all the time. And we do have a mission. And before it was the Castetter Cannabis Group, it was called the Castetter Sustainability Group, right? So that's a core mission for the firm generally. But, Kate, what would you say if it said, well, listen, you're just a corporate shill and you don't care about the environment. You just want everyone to grow a lot of pot and, damn the environment.
I mean, I think we all, especially, our generation, we all care about the environment. This is all of our future, is dependent on what we do now. And so what I would say is that you need to take a holistic approach to anything. You can have an outdoor operation that is extremely detrimental to the environment. You can have a greenhouse that also uses supplemental lighting, mixed lighting. There are innovative strategies to dealing with energy efficiency, and I don't think we can just cross them off the list. And that's what you're doing if you're only mandating this right off the bat.
Yeah.
So I think we need to take into account renewable usage, total site plans, performance of a total site, but also things like demand side management. Maybe somebody wants to run their operation, stagger it, run it at an unusual time at night when there's not peak demand on the electrical grid. We also have to consider the utilities themselves. They have a responsibility here too. They have a responsibility to update their infrastructure.
Yeah.
We've seen disastrous consequences of outdated utility infrastructure in Texas, in Portland, where, their grid couldn't handle, cannabis cultivators coming online. But, who's investigating, what utility companies are doing?
Yeah.
There's a huge stigma when it comes to cannabis. And I think we need to also think about how that stigma plays into how we scrutinize cannabis cultivator energy usage.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think so too. That's excellent points, Kate. And thanks for all your work on this. I mean, this is really an excellent report. I think it provides a lot of information, and it's something that was just absent from the conversation. That kind of data and that kind of understanding and technical understanding and breaking that down for lawmakers, policymakers, but also industry representatives. So. And thanks for coming on, the show. I know it was a long commute for you from your desk over there to join the show, but thanks. And I hope everyone listening, watching got a lot of perspective. And I was just thinking about this issue, no matter which side you're on. There shouldn't be a side. There shouldn't be sides anyways. But yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Kaylin.
Yeah, definitely. And so another episode of Empire State of Cannabis. The easiest way to know you're always going to get the best episodes coming up is to subscribe, like the Facebook page, and just to continue to check out for updates. We also have Taproot, which we kind of broke down this newspaper in our weekly newsletter. And so subscribe to that and reach out if you have any questions for Kate or myself and you want to talk about this issue. Reach out to us, LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, email, hate mail, whatever you want to send our way. So thanks, everybody.